Okay, good morning. Welcome back. We are now on lesson 2 of our coursework. Thank you all for your feedback that you gave me on lesson 1. So I had a few people mentioning things about key individuals. I'm going to send out an email separate about that. It's all really helpful stuff. It means that I can basically cater this as best I can to you guys. We're going to continue looking at all the ingredients that made up the outbreak of the First World War. But before we move on to our subject for today, just a reminder of where we were last lesson. So we looked at the alliance system. We saw that Bismarck, who had worked so hard to maintain a status quo, remember Germany, a brand new nation, 1871. This is not going to go down well with other nations that already have their power in Europe. Bismarck does his best to make sure that the balance of power is maintained, so that people like France, people like Russia, people like Britain aren't too concerned or aren't too worried in a military sense about what Germany are doing. Now, that is totally undermined when Wilhelm II takes the throne. Bismarck is relieved of his duties, and that neurotic behaviour of Kaiser Wilhelm II then starts to change the way that foreign policy is done in Germany, and instead it's a lot more aggressive, it's less cooperative. We see the lapsing of the reinsurance treaty, and that kind of starts the process of Russia, France, eventually Britain forming this triple entente. It's exactly what Bismarck looked to avoid. It's exactly what he didn't want because of the risk of a war on two fronts. Now, you started making decisions towards the end of last week about how responsible you feel Germany were for that. Was this a case of them being aggressive? Was it a case of them being ignorant? Or was it actually a case of other nations isolating the German nation? Now, you've got your own conclusions on that. Again, I'm not going to shape too much of that. What will be really good to see from your coursework is that actually you've all got different opinions on certain aspects of this course. So I'm going to leave that there for now. You've got your own internal judgment. Today's lesson is going to be focused on Germany again. We're going to be asking how much Germany is responsible here for how far Germany is responsible here for the outbreak of the First World War, but through the lens of something called Weltpolitik. Now, you looked at Weltpolitik in the early stages of your Germany course as well, so you should know what that means. German is a really weird language, so believe it or not, this actually means world politics or world policy. Crazy, I know. So this should be something that you already know about. This should be something that you're coming in with preconceived ideas about. And what we're going to do is we're going to see whether this foreign policy of Weltpolitik is an aggressive, so if we look at the learning objective here, whether that is an aggressive force responsible in the build-up to the First World War. Now, the way that we're going to look at this, there's going to be quite a few different strands that we look at here, so at times it might become slightly complicated, but I think the way that this lesson is done, it will all start to be put into place rather easily. So first, to find the term Weltpolitik, we've kind of already done that. We're obviously going to go into a bit more detail there. We're then going to look at the different interpretations regarding why Weltpolitik is actually deployed. We know that aggressive behaviour might be one of them because we saw that last lesson, but why do historians think that Weltpolitik was pursued, particularly just before the outbreak of the First World War? And then finally, we're going to start to then put that into a conclusion. We're going to start to decide, where do we stand on this debate? Is this the aggressive actions of Germany? Is it the role of other nations that are at hand? Or is this something totally different? Is it something that's misread by the international community? So first, definition. Second, well, why did this policy actually exist? Third, which of those interpretations do we agree with? I want to show you this because I think this structure is really important. Obviously, you've already got a far more detailed explanation of how the German government works. We know that men over 25 in Imperial Germany elect members of the Reichstag. We also know the role of the Bundesrat as well. We have our representatives from German states. But the three that I want you to focus on are the three that are highlighted here: the army, Kaiser Wilhelm II, and the government. Now, the reason I want you to focus on these three is partly to do with what I spoke about last week, on Tuesday. When we talk about Germany, because again, it's all in our learning objectives, it's all in our success criteria, it's in our title. Is Germany responsible? Well, when we look at this diagram, who are we talking about within Germany? Now, last week we would say that actually there was quite a bit of conflict between these two groups, the government, etc., the Chancellor, and Kaiser Wilhelm II. Now, as we go throughout this lesson, we're going to see those kind of disagreements happening again. So what I really want to start to happen is that our language moves away from talking about Germany and instead talks about, well, what part of Germany is responsible for certain aspects here. So what we might see today is that there is some conflict between these three, or possibly even some support between the government, the army, Kaiser Wilhelm. Another point to raise as well, and it's an interesting one, not just for this unit of work, but just in general. By the letter of the law, the Kaiser controls the army. He is the head of the army. He decides what they do. He can appoint, dismiss. He is the person legalistically in charge. That doesn't mean that the army can't be manipulative. That doesn't mean that the army can't, maybe not legalistically, but de facto control what the Kaiser does, or at least shepherd him into a tight corner where he has to act a certain way. Please keep that in mind, because, again, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to start to change the way we talk about Germany as a country. We can't say Germany are responsible for the war. Who in Germany are responsible for the war? Because it isn't these guys, it isn't the men over 25. So again, specific terminology is really key here. Now, start with defining that word Weltpolitik. As I said, this is literally world policy. This is a name given to the imperial government policy from 1897 to start to look at how they expand the military, how they start to have a political say on things that are probably outside of Germany's borders, but also their economic influence. Again, a new nation is going to be required to have those things possibly tweaked or altered. If we were looking at this from Bismarck's perspective, we'd want to make sure that these are done quite, what's the word I'm looking for here? In a quite reserved manner. So he's not going to want to upset the status quo too much. But what we need to do is have a look at how they change from 1897 onwards. Now, this is where I want to draw your attention to. Well, actually, I'm going to go through this with you because I think it's important that we get this definition down. And if obviously we're in a classroom, I'd probably do this slightly differently. But there are three kind of main strands to Weltpolitik, and it's basically these last three statements here: military, political, and economic influence. Now, if we look at what Weltpolitik does, and these are the kind of three things that we would draw out as three ways that it manifests. First, acquiring more land, building an empire. This is politics. This is that political strand in action here. Now you get the term Mittelafrika, which is where Germany starts to create a bit of an empire within the central parts of Africa. They are less resource rich. They're less, what's the word I'm looking for here? They're less valuable to empires because they're not coastal as well as that. But Germany start to open up their political boundaries. So when we look at these three strands here, military, political and economic, that political strand looks like this: Middle Africa, colonies. Then we've got the expansion of the naval power. So this is now our military strand of Weltpolitik. And this is where we focus on Flottenpolitik, and we'll get to that in a bit more detail in a moment, although I do believe you know that phrase. And then finally, that economic influence. So trade links. How do we open up our economic horizons? How do we start now to become a global superpower in terms of trade? That's the third, and again, on that slide there, that third strand of Weltpolitik. Now, I'm going to do this slightly differently to how it is in your booklet, but based on this definition, based on what I've spoken to you about, if you go to your booklet, you will see that there's a space not on page 9, but on page 10. And on page 10, basically what I want you to do is I want you to just describe what the basic aims of Weltpolitik are. And with those three specific examples, so as I've just said, you've got the economic strand, you've got the political strand, and you've got the military strand. I just want you to describe for me what Weltpolitik is in this section. I want you to describe what its aims are. Try and give those three specific examples there. If you need to go back and pause on the slide I was on just to give you a little bit of help, that's fine. This is kind of just our introductory start to the lesson, so I don't want to spend too much time on this. I want to make sure that you have the definition down. So pause if you need to and get that definition down for me. Once you're done, press play again and we'll start to go through the rest of what the lesson has. So if you haven't paused, then I'm not sure what you're doing. Please make sure that that is done. But let's move on now and have a look at what's next. So in terms of definition of that word, we've got it. We know what Weltpolitik is now. You would have seen it. Oh, I don't know what else. Yeah, great. Don't know why that's gone away. You know what that is, even from your first lessons of Germany with either me or Mr. Hinchliffe. Now, what we're going to focus on now is what those different historical interpretations are. So what is the motivation behind Weltpolitik? Why do these nations feel a need to actually... what does Germany feel a need to actually pursue this? Now, again, you've probably got your own preconceived ideas. You've probably got this idea of Germany being an aggressive nation. We saw it last lesson. This idea of Germany wanting power, being a hungry power nation. Even if we look at the image that I've just been showing you, this doesn't really paint Germany in a positive light. This doesn't really place Germany in a position where it looks like it's being passive. They're quite an aggressive nation, and that's the perception that's given based on last lesson, but also based on what we're learning about so far. However, what we will start to see is that actually those different interpretations or different reasonings give us a bit more of a wider picture of what Weltpolitik might be. Now, I've got an example here from Fischer. You will focus a lot on Fischer as you do your reading for your coursework. So, in Fischer's view, Weltpolitik was a grand plan involving continental and overseas expansion in order to attain world power. From 87 onwards, Germany embarked on a course at aiming nothing less than parity. So that means a kind of equalness, of fairness with the British World Empire, if not more. This has aggressive overtones. This makes it sound as if actually Germany's sole purpose here is to be a big military power. Britain, who had the strongest navy on the planet at this point, are the main contenders, or the main rivals to the Germans. This sounds very much like a conflict between the two before war was even, spoken about as an option. This might spell a kind of aggressive form of Weltpolitik. But if we go back to our booklet now, you'll see that I've given you 3 types of interpretation here. Now, in terms of Fischer's argument, so, expanding power, challenging the power that Britain has, this would be something that could be considered an aggressive policy to expand Germany's power. So that's one argument about why, I'm turning German now, about why Weltpolitik is deployed as a policy. However, there are a couple of other arguments. Now, this one's quite interesting, a diversionary tactic, so, aim to make you look away from domestic tensions. So are there problems within Germany where the government are thinking, well, if we make our flagship policy something that looks outside of the nation, the German public aren't going to get too engaged in these domestic tensions. It's going to make it a lot easier for us to run a country. And then finally, on kind of similar lines here, a policy of patriotism to unite the country behind a common purpose. So is there something here that actually shows the government not so much looking for aggression, but just looking for their people to get behind the nation? Now, what I want you to do, and again, we've kind of done this in a slightly different way. I've had to think about this, and if you've done it a different way, that's fine. And if you're pausing and if you're chopping and changing what you're looking at, that's fine. I've wanted to do this a slightly different way because I think it makes a little bit more sense to do it this way. So I'm just getting my paperwork here. Now, I want you to start by first looking through the interpretations. So what we've got here is we've got a number of different sources that all feed into one of, if not more, of these arguments. Now, what this will do is this will give us a really good understanding of what the thinking is behind Weltpolitik. Once we've done that, we're going to go through the actual events that constitute what Weltpolitik actually looks like. Now, going through these, please do bear in mind that they might kind of be more. There might be more than one colour that you'd see in your box here. So if I start with source 1, I'll go through that with you. Your job will then be to do sources 2 through to source 6. Don't worry about this table just yet. We'll come to that at the very end. So let's have a look at source 1. I'm just going to keep that there because I keep forgetting what colours I've used. So from an article written by the Press Bureau of the Imperial Army Office in 1900. So, the concept of the Navy has indeed, as Prince Bismarck once said, been the hearth around which German attempts at unity have clustered and warmed themselves. Now that's quite a wordy statement here. What this is basically saying is that the Navy is something that has been utilised to try and unite the country. This has been something that's been used before by German governments to get people behind them. So what I would say here is that this is definitely something to try and invoke patriotism. So I'd say, okay, well, if the Navy is the hearth around which German attempts at unity have clustered and warmed themselves, this is quite clearly what the Germans are trying to achieve. It has, however, been allocated with the further task of overcoming the discord between the parties in the United German Empire and directing the minds of the disputants towards a higher goal. This is slightly different now. This is now talking about trying to distract the German public. Have a look here. Further task of overcoming the discord between the parties. This is now not only about building a national unity, but it's also about dealing with some of those problems. So these two kind of go hand in hand on occasion. You can probably use these two in conjunction more often than not, but they are slightly separate points. The greatness and glory of the fatherland. Right, now that sounds very nationalistic. Today, millions of our compatriots are spiritually alienated from the state and the prevailing economic order. The concept of the Navy possesses the power to revive the national spirit of the classes and fill them once again with patriotic loyalty and love for the Kaiser and the Reich. Nothing said there about aggressive policy to expand power, but a lot said about trying to get the German people behind its nation. Have a read through the rest of those sources, and what should start to happen is you should start to see a little bit more of a of a picture emerging about how Weltpolitik maybe isn't quite as simple as Germany being power hungry. Maybe there are a few more elements here. So go through each of these. Again, I'm not going to go through everyone with you, and by the end of that, so again, give the video a pause. We'll then have a look at what that manifests itself into and the events that take place. Okay, so hopefully you paused and have done that. What I would say here is it's really important for you to see this as an exercise where you're going to have to form some judgments. So even though, yes, source 1 doesn't really talk about expansion of Germany's power, what you need to think about is all of these sources in conjunction. What seems to be the theme that's continuing? Are there elements where they disagree? You're going to have to form opinions on this. This is what your coursework is going to be. And I say opinions, that's probably not a very good word to use. You're going to form judgments. You're going to evaluate the evidence that you see and decide eventually, okay, who is responsible for the First World War? So hopefully what you've done is you've looked through each of these and you've seen how all of your kind of, all of your highlighting might be painting a bit of a visual picture for you here. Again, if you're seeing a lot of this yellow here, a lot of this aggressive nature, that should tell you something about Germany's intent here. And again, I said Germany, try and break it down between whose intent. If you're seeing a lot of green, diversionary tactics, etc., etc., use this as a visual representation that's going to help you form your opinion. This is a lot more difficult for me to do without you in a classroom, because what I would do now is I would ask somebody in the room what they think, what their opinion is, what they've kind of found from these sources. So it's really now based on your independent work. But we'll leave that there for now, because what we're going to do is not only do we have sources that explain these different approaches to Weltpolitik or the different motivations behind it, we also have events, and this is now going backwards. I know it's a little bit confusing. It's going backwards and looking at the events that happen as a result of this Weltpolitik. Now, I know it says here to highlight the most valuable evidence in yellow. You can do that if you want to. I'm not going to stop your methods of learning here, but what I might recommend, because this is going to help with your last activity, is I might recommend using the colour coding system that you've used here. I think it will just be a lot more visual. It'll be a lot easier to follow. Again, if you want to just highlight in yellow and then eventually form your conclusion, that's fine. I've got no problem with that. I'm just giving you my kind of opinion or advice here. So you're going to do essentially the same. You're going to read through the actual events, and it's going to be highlighting in those 3 different colours here in our key. But I'm going to go through one with you because there's a little bit of detail that's been missed off, a little bit of detail that isn't included, that I would like you to get down, because I think it's important that we understand this. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 events. Weltpolitik, 1912 election, social imperialism, the first Moroccan crisis, and the second Moroccan crisis. Now, the first Moroccan crisis has a gap here, and again, I probably would do this differently in a classroom, but I essentially want us to fill in some bits that are missing here. But let's have a read through it first. Let's have a look at what it says, and then we can come back to that. So the first Moroccan crisis. In March 1905, Kaiser Wilhelm made a visit to Tangier in Morocco. which was, at least in theory, within the French sphere of influence. So the same way that Germany are looking for their place in the sun, and actually I missed that out a little bit here, but a really important phrase here, Germany's place in the sun, it's increasing its colonial power. And actually I'll come back to this because I should have spoken about that a little bit. In terms of that, the French have already got theirs. The French have already got their empire. So Germany's trying to match that. Not only trying to match Britain, but trying to get their place in the sun, possibly off of areas like France. Germany demanded an international conference to discuss the future of Morocco at the that should say Algeciras, not Algericus. So I guess you can't do this, but I'm going to change it here. So at the Algeciras conference, Morocco was confirmed. So just draw my pen. Confirmed in the French sphere of influence. To make matters worse, the fracas had strengthened the entente between Britain and France, rather than driving a wedge between them and Germany. Them as Germany had hoped. So what Germany were looking for here is they were looking for a way that they could disrupt the entente. So, and I'm going to explain that in a little bit more detail now. This is all political. This is all about a kind of aggressive way of challenging what exists outside of Germany's borders. Germany don't really have any business talking about the French sphere of influence. So this is very much political. If we're thinking about our three specific examples, it's very much an aggressive way to challenge already existing power. Now on top of this, just to add a little bit of information here, and this is what I'm going to type, I want you to write it with me. These decisions, and I'm going to come back to our individuals here, we've got Bülow mentioned, and we've also got Tirpitz. So Bülow represents our government aspect of our hierarchy at the moment. Tirpitz represents the army. So they're the two individuals. I'm going to talk a little bit more at the end about how you can remember those individuals. Now, with our first Moroccan crisis, there's a little bit more that goes on here. So Bülow, and I'm going to type this down, who is obviously he's the Chancellor at the time. Bülow felt that the time had come for Germany to show France that they could not have Morocco, or I spelled Morocco wrong, Morocco all to themselves. Bülow sent a flurry of telegrams from Berlin and planted stories of the planned visit in newspapers to ensure the Kaiser could not back down. So what I mean by this, or what happened, remember I said that there's a way that maybe, even though yes, the Kaiser appoints the Chancellor, yes, the Kaiser is in control of the army, the Kaiser can be manipulated. Now, imagine a scenario today where you've heard in the news for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, right, Boris Johnson's going to do this, Boris Johnson's going to do this, Boris Johnson's going to do this. And a support for that arises and people become excited that Boris Johnson is going to do whatever it is he plans on doing. And then he eventually backs down. He says, actually, I'm not going to do that. So this is kind of manipulation of the highest order here. By leaking these stories, it makes it very hard for the Kaiser to refuse to intervene in the Moroccan situation. Now, on top of this, the Kaiser had also labelled himself the protector of all Muslim people. It's a pretty bold claim, particularly coming from a European man. Obviously Morocco, Muslim nation, they're not too keen, or at least parts of Morocco won't be too keen on the French having power over them. So by the Kaiser saying this, some of those Moroccan Muslims might be thinking, well, hold on a second, you've got to now do something. Now, what the whole purpose of this, I might just get this down as well here, the purpose of this intervention was to undermine or destroy the Entente Cordiale, so the agreement that existed between Britain and France. But all it does, and I'm going to type this down too, it leaves a dangerous residue of mistrust and resentment among both the publics of the nations involved as well as its leaders. Germany, the Kaiser, Bülow, totally ineffective in actually pulling out what they want to here. All they do is strengthen the Entente, and all they do now is cause France and Britain to be looking over their shoulder thinking, well, hold on a second. If they're happy to get themselves involved in this political situation, what else do we have to be wary of? It starts to really sow a seed of total mistrust now for the German nation. This is all political. These are all aggressive nations. It's something that is designed to destroy the Entente, and it leaves behind that dangerous residue. That's my colour that I've used from the key before. I want you to go through the rest of these now, and I want you to do the exact same. Again, if you're just highlighting yellow, fine, not a problem. You'll have to categorise these anyway, but I'd recommend just make life easy for yourself. Use that colour coding to actually go through each of these different events here. What we'll then do is we'll talk about what we're going to do with that information and how we can start to form some conclusions. So you might want to pause here again, and then as soon as you're done, press play and we will talk through the final part of the lesson. So we've spoken about we've spoken about the different aspects of Germany. We've looked at different examples of what different interpretations, of why Weltpolitik actually is a policy that's pursued. We've now looked at those examples of what that looks like, how this can be, what this essentially manifests into. And what we can start to do actually is, if we look at our definition at the earlier stages of the lesson, we spoke economics, expansionism, political influence. We can see all of that in every single one of these boxes. If we look at social imperialism here, I'm going to use the black pen here. We've trying to find it now. We've got Germany gaining a lease on a port in China. China's richest provinces open for German economic markets. Okay, perfect. We've seen Weltpolitik manifest itself into a actual tangible outcome here. This is quite clearly something that's being pursued. But if we look at it on the other side, the expansionism, well, what we see in the second Moroccan crisis is that actually Germany gains 2 strips of land in Congo. So we see that expansionism also having a tangible effect. If we look at political influence, military influence here, expansionism, well, these naval laws, there's 38 battleships in over 20 years, 6 battleships in a law passed 6 years later. This is now that expansionism, this is now that military aspect. So every single strand of Weltpolitik that we spoke about in the very early stage of the lesson has manifested itself. We need to come to the conclusion of why. Is this, and again, how you've colour-coded this will help you massively, is this the result of an aggressive nature? Is this a result of getting people behind the government? Is this a result of actually trying to divert people away from some of the internal problems that Germany are facing? Now that's when we go down to our final activity, and that is where again we've got, what have I done? Oops. That's where we've got our 3 different strands of thinking here, and all you need to do is you need to look through all the notes that you've seen today, and you need to basically start to populate this table. So what is the evidence of the aggressive policy to expand German power? What is the evidence of a diversionary tactic? What is the evidence of a policy of patriotism? Now what I could do here is I could just give you a little bit of help here, just give you a kind of kickstarter in terms of what we're doing. We've got 3 different points here, and all I've done here is I've just summarised what they might look like. So actually the aggressive policy towards Germany's power, Flottenpolitik is one of those examples. 38 ships in 20 years, this is definitely something that's there to show an aggressive expansion of Germany. First Moroccan crisis we've gone through together. Second Moroccan crisis, well they effectively do start to expand their power. So these are all things that fit within that boundary. Now what I don't want you to do is I don't want you to do what I've done, write word by word. I want you to give maybe a sentence or two, a brief summary of why you've included it in that box, or in that column, sorry. And it might not just be that one event fits into one column. You might see it as effectively something that can fit in all three or two, etc., etc. So have a look through that. And again, I don't want it to take you too long. I don't need notes that are ridiculously long. Have a look at the size of the box. They're not designed to be something that takes you, an hour to complete. I just want you now to have a look back through the evidence. You might even use some of these sources as well to help back up your points here. And I want you to just jot down, bullet point form, give it a little bit of explanation where we see evidence for each of these different interpretations of Weltpolitik. Again, pause here, have a go at that. I've given you your examples, and then we'll come back and we'll look at the final aspect of what this lesson's offering. Now, what I would like to think is that by this stage, your opinions or your judgments of this are starting to come across quite well. So what I'm hoping we do each lesson is that as we kind of put more pieces to the puzzle, your opinions start to maybe change, get challenged. But by now, we should have an idea based on our alliance system lesson last week and now this process of Weltpolitik. How much responsibility, if any, does Germany share, and how does that responsibility manifest? I'm hoping you've already reached those opinions before we've reached this stage. If you haven't, it might be worth reading through and weighing up, evaluating exactly what exists here. Now, the way that I might do that, for example, is just by the sheer amount of different colours I see. If I can see an extraordinary amount of yellow and not very much blue, this quite clearly is going to be something that stands out to me. I'm going to think this is the kind of main cause, or the main motivation, the main reason. And if it is, then Germany share quite a lot of responsibility. Have a look through. I can't stress enough how important it is that you start to make your judgments through these lessons. You can't all have the same opinion. If you do, it'd be, it'd be strange if you did. But we need to make sure that we are using that evidence as we're actually going along. Now, the last thing I've got for you is something called historiography. It's a complicated word. It's a word that I was only introduced to at university. So by showing you this word now, you're already, 2 years ahead of where I was. Historiography is basically what has been said about a historical topic or a historical controversy. So in my university essays, I was often told I need to include more historiography. What that meant is that I needed maybe a paragraph or two discussing what has already been said about my particular focus before I get into my argument. The logic behind that is that if you understand what's been said before, then you know the debate that's taken place beforehand, and you know exactly what people have said, and you can use that to platform your own idea. Now, we've got three interpretations, and I'll be really honest with you, it's entirely up to you what you decide to do with those interpretations. We haven't given you a space to write anything, but I think it's worth reading through these and deciding, okay, well, what is being said, and is there an interpretation that I agree with most? So if I look at AJ P. Taylor, and I have a look at his interpretation, let's just have a read through and let's just see what we can draw from that. So, the continuation of peace would have brought Germany the mastery of Europe within a few years. This was prevented by the habit of her diplomacy. Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, that probably means things like the lapse of the reinsurance treaty. It probably means things like the Moroccan crisis, and still more by the mental outlook of her people. They had trained themselves psychologically for aggression. Okay, well, if we're thinking about now the colours that we had beforehand, this is essentially saying that Germany have acted aggressively. The German military plans played a vital part. Right, okay, well, that's quite clearly referring to our Weltpolitik. The other great powers thought in terms of defending themselves. No Frenchman thought seriously of recovering Alsace and Lorraine, so we know that that's what makes Germany and France historic enemies. And the struggle of the Slavs and Germans in the Balkans was very great nonsense as far as most of the Russians were concerned. The German generals wanted a decisive victory for its own sake. Though they complained of encirclement, it was German policy that created this encirclement. Now, I know for a fact that some of you would have had that conclusion coming out of the last lesson, but to see it actually written down in an interpretation now gives it a little bit more credence, and that's why when you're writing your coursework, historiography is so important. What this is clearly saying is that Germany is, and I've got a dog barking outside, sorry if that's distracting, it's definitely distracting me. What this is saying is that Germany, if they had actually continued on this peaceful route that they're on through Bismarck's work, they could have been the world power that they wanted to be. However, they've gone about it in a slightly more aggressive way, and actually they've poked France and Russia. Yes, okay, France have their problems with Germany, so do Russia, but it's through this diplomacy, this aggressive diplomacy, these problems arise. So we've got one interpretation here. Now I might go through a second one with you just to show you how I would kind of point out key differences here. Let's have a look at what David Blackburn says. So, German responsibility for war should not be restricted to the issue of whether Bethmann, he is the chancellor that actually takes Germany into war, or the German government or Kaiser desired peace in 1912 or 14, or for that matter earlier. Of course they would have preferred what they wanted without war. Now this, even though AJP Taylor doesn't say the Kaiser wanted war, through the language he's using here, it makes it seem like war would have been the only thing to satisfy the German hierarchy. Blackburn's disagreeing slightly, so you see the nuance here. He's saying that actually they probably did want peace. They probably didn't want to go through war, but they eventually did. But German actions going back to the 1890s has done much to create international tension. Bethmann personally once was a sensitive, passive, fatalistic man, but he was faced with reaping the whirlwind sown by his predecessors. Others bore more responsibility, like Tirpitz, who built a battle fleet aimed at the British but professed peaceful intentions. Now this is talking about Flottenpolitik. Again, Bethmann, Chancellor. Tirpitz, head of the army. Kaiser Wilhelm, head of the nation. All different aspects of Germany here. This is really interesting, and this is why I showed you that diagram at the beginning here. When we say Germany share responsibility, who in Germany share responsibility? I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I do think it's really interesting that, or I think it's an effective use of your time to go through these interpretations. Maybe write down what you agree with. Maybe write a conclusion based on what you actually think at this moment, because what should start to happen is all of the activities that we've done should start to form your conclusion of our overall question here. And the question isn't actually on the worksheet. Hold on. Go back to the top here. Was Germany responsible for the outbreak of the First World War through Weltpolitik? Was Germany an aggressive force responsible in the build-up to the First World War? Now you might decide, and I think this is an effective way to do this, that you subscribe to one of these 3 points of view, that actually Weltpolitik was the result of one of these 3 things. But then you might add layers to that. Well, okay, because of these 3 things, does it lead to this encirclement? Because of these 3 things, or sorry, out of these 3 individuals, who is responsible for the aggression? Who is responsible for this outward-looking Germany? And that should give you then a conclusion. We haven't given you a space to write that conclusion, but I think it would be really worth your time to get some lined paper and just to write your thoughts, just to write that evaluative conclusion about how far you believe Weltpolitik is something that is aggressive, and how far you think actually this gives responsibility to Germany. How much does this make Germany responsible for the outbreak of the First World War? What we have now is an understanding of how German diplomacy leads to an alliance system that damages German prospects in a war. We've now looked at how Weltpolitik, as a policy, is something that agitates the international community. These 2 questions are your key questions to kind of come out today with. And hopefully, when I send out our next lesson, you'll have a conclusion based on who you think is responsible and what you think the, what's the aim here? What are they trying to do? That's essentially all I've got to go through with you. What I will say is, just to go back up to the top here, I overlooked this point here at the beginning, but it is worth reading. It just gives a little bit more background on what Weltpolitik means. This quote, I can't emphasize it enough, a place in the sun. That is the quote that you need to take out from this lesson, particularly as it's something that is it will show up again in later lessons. Right, you are currently at the point where your Italy assignments, by the time you watch this video, should be out to you. Your Germany assessments will be coming to you until next Friday. So Friday the 15th will be the latest that you receive your marks back from your Germany paper. You'll be sent a form which has feedback for you to respond to. If we don't see that feedback before, and I think Mr. Hinchliffe has sent the dates out now, I can't actually remember them off the top of my head, but have a look at that email. We need to see that feedback. That is going to count towards something that shows you're engaged with the subject during lockdown. On top of that, any questions that you do have from now on regarding structure of the lessons, regarding structure of your coursework, reading, you need to have a look at the table that both me and Mr. Hinchliffe have sent out, and you need to look at who your personal tutor is. You have your name in a table. They are your first port of call, so please do refer to that. Feedback again, greatly welcomed, and yeah, I hope you're all doing well, and I will see you next time. Thank you.